Today we have the privilege of speaking with Gaya Herrington, a renowned sustainability researcher and economist. Gaya gained international recognition for her 2021 study, Update to Limits to Growth, which revisited the seminal 1972 Club of Rome report and assessed its projections against current data. Her work emphasizes the urgent need to shift from an economic model centered on perpetual growth to one that prioritizes human and ecological well-being. Currently serving as the Vice President of Sustainability Research at Schneider Electric, Gaya continues to advocate for systemic change in how corporations approach sustainability. In our conversation today, we'll delve into the concept of design or disaster, the challenges and opportunities of integrating circularity into profit-driven companies, the moral implications of relentless growth, and certainly the narratives that can drive meaningful systems change. Welcome today, Gaya.
Pleasure to be here.
So thanks for joining us. And I think for sharing with our listeners, the journey is important to begin with. So your career has spanned roles from economic policy advisor at the Dutch Central Bank to Director of Sustainability Services at KPMG, and now Vice President of ESG Research at Schneider Electric. So can you share what inspired this journey into sustainability and how these diverse experiences have really shaped your perspective?
Yeah, so I started actually in a very, you could call traditional mainstream economics setting. I studied, my first master's was in econometrics, so that's very the neoclassical economics. As you said, I actually started working at banks, so in finance, then to the Dutch Central Bank. So very much within that more traditional thinking and looking at the economic system. Then I left because I thought, well, especially after the global financial crisis, I thought we were clearly missing something. And that really started my journey into looking at what is it that we're missing. So at that point, it was still relatively, you could say, ESG. So, we have to just incorporate these other environmental and social and governance factors into the current system. This is typically how a journey in sustainability starts. You think you can still innovate yourself out of it. If consumers just make the green choice, green growth can totally happen and save us. And then the more you research, the more you end up in that true sustainability is completely different almost from ESG. And it's really, if you want anything that's truly sustainable, meaning it can last, right? You need to change the economic system. So I thought I had left economics and finance, and then through the sustainability journey, now I'm back being an economist. So that's just, that's just my lot in life. But this time I'm not a neoclassical economist. I have a lot of criticism of it. And I think we absolutely will not reach any kind of sustainable state in the world without transforming our economic system. So that is mostly what I'm working on right now.
So sometimes you think people would, on one hand, approach environment and sustainability because we want to have well-being on our planet. But then this whole concept of economics, it completely is intertwined. I mean, you have to have then systemic change in order to really make this blend.
Our economic system is a social construct. This is important to realize because sometimes people think that it's something outside of society. And that's not true. Our economy is wholly embedded in our society. We co-create it. And society is wholly embedded in our environment. And so whatever we do to the environment is not an externality. It will come back to us. And that's, of course, what we're seeing right now.
So when you talk about, if you could share a little bit about the original 1972 report, the limits to growth, and then your update to it in 2021, and how on par is that?
Yes. So in 1972, a group of MIT scientists, they started with they were also curious, and they started with questions like, why, despite all our progress and innovation, because humans are very innovative, do we still see these persistent levels of poverty and pollution and conflict and that sort of thing? Why haven't we solved that yet then? And I think to answer that question, they did something very similar to what I just described. They said, well, a lot of these models are they assume a lot of implicit constancy. A lot of economic models, for example, lots of the variables are exogenous, and they had a new modeling technique called system dynamics modeling, where all variables interact, which I think is a better way to model systems like our world. And so with it, they ran several scenarios to see where how different futures could pan out. And what they found was that the business as usual scenario, in which they assume that the priority for our economy remains industrial output growth, ended in a steep collapse, a steep decline, which is sometimes called collapse, setting in around now, so current time. This was in the 70s, and they predicted this decades into the future. There were also other scenarios, and some of them did not end in collapse, but the business as usual one did. And that one was based on historical data only, so no additional assumptions about human behavior.
And would that be worldwide in all types of economies, or
It was a
specifically?
global model.
Okay.
So in many ways, it was an imperfect model because there are large differences between world regions. But yes, it was a global model. So that was predicted for the world. There were other scenarios where a collapse was avoided, for example, but there they assumed that society made a very conscious break with the past and shifted priorities away from industrial output growth toward human and ecological well-being. And in that, the well-being level, which was also variable for human beings, did also stop increasing around now, but then it remained the same instead of going down. The reason I just misspoke and said, because I typically say collapse, I typically refer to a collapse as a steep decline. Because whenever people hear collapse, they think, oh, it's the end of humanity. And that was never predicted. That's also one of the criticisms the book got at the time. Like, this is just a doom scenario. And it wasn't. It was a warning. But humanity is not going to end. But it does signal a steep decline in human well-being, which is still something we would like to avoid.
Well, and in many ways, in different parts of the world, we are seeing that. If we look at our own political climate here in the U.S., obviously the changes that have just recently occurred with currently pulling out of the World Health Organization or removing the U.S. from the Paris Treaty. Uh, does that concern you? Do you feel like it's too close to the predictive reality that could happen with this decline?
Yeah, so that brings us to my research. So what I did just a few years ago is compare empirical data with those scenarios from a few decades ago. And as it turns out, empirical data is very closely aligned to their business as usual scenario. So it's incredibly prescient of the authors at the time. And it's almost I don't even know how to describe how I feel about it, but it's a bit eerie to see how what they said is currently happening. This pulling out of the World Health Organization and the Paris Agreement. That's exactly what they said. They said if you want to maintain industrial output growth, resources will be pulled away from other things like human well-being and ecological protection. It's exactly what we're seeing right now. It will still never be enough. So let's be clear about that. This, like a lot of other scientists by now have said, like a lot of Earth scientists that warn about climate breakdown, etc. But at the time, the author said as well, growth will halt one way or another. So either we choose our own limits, or we will have them forced upon us. So that's also why this title is it by design or by disaster?
Well, that makes complete sense. So we can design a more hopeful future, one that we don't completely disappear from, or it can be forced on us by disaster. So when you
Yes.
say disaster, you mean anything from economical, health related, resources, any
So
of that?
collapse is it's not going to be one thing. That's why these organizations like the WEF, the World Economic Forum, and stuff. This word polycrisis has been gaining traction. These interconnected social, economic, technological, and environmental threats. That's exactly what was already predicted. An often missed thing about the limits to growth is the S, the plural. But of course, humanity is very innovative. We can innovate ourselves out of one limit. And then with those efforts that you did, the unintended consequences of that, a new limit comes there. And over time, you'll see that they come faster and faster. So, and one of the authors, Dennis Meadows at the time, was asked, how will we know if we've reached collapse? And he said, the first thing to go is our ability to cope. And that's what this polycrisis is. It's humanity losing its ability to cope.
The psychological aspect. I mean, we're interconnected, our minds and our bodies. So then on your research, looking into the update to the limits of growth, is there a solution?
Yes, of course, and that's the next question then, right? Wait, if growth isn't the ultimate goal, then what should it be? And it's so I get that question all the time, and it's so interesting because it's like, well, how about we the thing we are already pretending it is, right? Because no company's vision statement says a world where profit grows perpetually. It
True.
all talks
Very true.
about how you contribute to human and ecological well-being, how you contribute to society, because on some level we all feel that's what they should do.
Right.
And so that's what I propose, that we make an economy where that is actually happening, because it's not the case right now. That we're all adults here. It's not what's going
It's not
on here.
happening.
We have these companies that they go people, planet, profit, and sometimes those align. But whenever people and planet uh, form a trade-off with profit, what wins? We all know
Yeah.
the answer to that.
Good point.
So, it has to be strictly subordinate to this overall goal of well-being, and that's what I propose.
So these profit-driven companies, don't you think some of the leaders, they're people too? They go home at night. Is it not on their mind to think, people planet first, or how do we, incorporate both? Why do you think maybe society has become so? If we don't grow, we're stagnant, or we're not doing well. The whole grow, grow, grow concept.
Right. Yeah. And so, first of all, yes, I think it's the system, and we can change the system. That's why I always emphasize that our economy is a social construct. Humans have created this, and we can change it. Because I completely agree. There are some a small percentage of people are truly born a sociopath and don't care, but most of us are actually quite altruistic. So this Homo economicus in the neoclassical economics doesn't describe us well at all. We can be selfish, which typically happens when our basic needs are unmet, and then we get very short-term focused. But as soon as those are met, we actually become so much more curious and altruistic and playful than this Homo economicus. And that's also how this current economic system, even the winners, right, even in the richest countries where the upper class is, a lot of them are not that happy because a lot of their emotional and spiritual needs are unmet in this current economic system that tells us all that we're selfish, never satisfied consumers. That there's a lot of mental suffering if you feel that what you do, for example, serves no purpose. A lot of us actually, again, once our basic needs are met, if we're hungry, we don't care. But we all need to sleep, we need a roof over our head. But once those things are met, we actually have such a longing to leave this world a little bit better than we found it. And for most people in this world, they never get to really get that sense of purpose.
So, with the organizations out there, are there any examples that you can say, oh, they're really successfully integrating their circular practices without compromising their financial performance? Is there an example that stands out?
There's nothing wrong with profit making. So in a well-being economy, we're still going to have profitable businesses. I want to be very clear about that. But there is a difference between profit making and profit maximizing. And that's a crucial distinction. So if you want to be innovative without ever investing in circular models and that sort of thing, that's not possible. So yes, there are companies that are doing this successfully, that are profitable with circular offerings. There are also plenty of companies that think, oh, this circular thing seems to be the new thing, let's hop on it. That's not what circularity is, because circularity is specifically to not grow in total resources. So the difference between a company that's really trying to be circular and ones that just want to jump on a bandwagon by whether they're talking about self-cannibalization. Because there's this thing of, yeah, but wait, if we refurbish products, they're not going to buy new ones. I'm like, yes, that's the point of circularity, that you reduce your ecological footprint. If that's upsetting to you, you don't really want circularity. You just want a new product to sell even more. And that goes again to this idea of that's why it doesn't work unless profit is really in service to what you're really trying to do.
Okay. So I don't want to bring up any one particular company, but I need to think of an example. You know, if our listeners are wondering, well, give me an example when you say you don't want to recycle products because then they won't buy new ones. So a very basic example, let's say Nike, they recycle all these types of shoes, whether it's their brand or not. And then they say that if, you know, you go into the store and you want to buy a new shoe and you see the, what is it? The rubber sole. If it's the speckled one, then that means it's recycled product. I mean, is it as basic as that, as taking products, our resources, and reincorporating into products that they still continue to sell?
Yeah, so reusing resources is absolutely part of the solution. But again, is it the overall goal is what matters? So are you doing that because it's just an extra product line that you can now sell? Or are you really trying to reduce your ecological footprint? Nike hasn't. It has let go of its carbon emissions goals recently. So they don't advertise that. But so it's not there. So that's how you know what the difference is. An example of a company that really made those investments, I would say, is Ørsted. That's an energy company. So it used to be a pretty heavy fossil fuel user, and then at some point they became really innovative. They looked at the longer term, and then they said, well, there is no other solution than going renewable, and so now they're a fully renewable company. Does that mean that during that transition they probably didn't maximize profits? I think that's entirely likely. And that goes to the other part of the answer to your question. When you talk about financial performance, it really depends on the horizon you're taking, because in the short run, this is just investment 101. It's not possible to just have quarterly results in as much as you can while you're also being super innovative. That's not how it works. You have to invest sometimes, but it goes towards long-term profitability. And that's often when I talk to companies as well, when they said, well, how do we maintain financial performance while also being sustainable? I'm like, you're acting like business as usual will give you that sustained financial performance, and it won't. That goes back to what I said, like the business landscape is going to change one way or another anyway. So
then how do they incorporate well-being and thinking of that? Let's say a company like the one you gave an example, you're not going to be profitable for a period of time as you evolve and change. Could that potentially ruin a business? I mean, how do you really incorporate? It's got to be a wider, broader systemic change.
that's why government policy is very important to make it conducive. But again, I am sometimes a bit struck by these mixed messages that I'm getting from some companies. It's like on one hand you're super innovative and you don't need regulation, but so don't kill our vibe, because we're going to just bring all this innovation to the market, and you can't adapt to this because you might miss, like, investment is a pretty basic concept, right? You do this all the time. You invest in things and then you know that you're gonna get the payoff later. Why is it so difficult here? Given the enormous stakes, like the how bad the economy would be. I'm saying this a bit jokingly because it's like we're way beyond what the stock market would do if we have ecosystem collapse. But ecosystem collapse is not going to be good for the economy either. So I just there's a bit of a dichotomy there, I find, in their stance.
So, with, for example, can you explain to us a little bit what you do at Schneider Electric, how that's relevant to the growth?
Yeah, so I try not to talk about it too much because people are always like, "Oh God, here comes the the marketing," and which is totally fair. But so first of all, they do pay me to do this kind of research, right, about economic transformation. They support me talking about it here and on others. I talk about I have a TED talk at conferences, and I talk about how profit should be subordinate to the human and ecological well-being. So there's that. We were voted most sustainable corporation in the world last year by Time Magazine and this year by Corporate Knights. That is a misnomer. There is no sustainable company in the world today. If you look at what sustainability truly means, which means that you stay within your fair share of Earth's carrying capacity. No company is doing that today. But what I think that title does mean is that we do genuinely try. We did not give up our DEI initiatives when Trump was elected or any of that stuff. We have not pulled back on our carbon emission goals and all the other stuff. So we are genuinely trying.
So when we talk about the update to limits of growth, in all your research there, and what they projected in the 1970s, putting it just about now, in order to avoid having such a decline, is this a movement that has to happen globally simultaneously? And that's the messaging trying to put out there? Or is it going to happen with leaders of certain countries or companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you for the question. I don't always get the opportunity to say that. The responsibility lies squarely under rich economies. So when I talk about letting go of growth, I am absolutely not talking about sub-Saharan Africa. So, there's a real difference in going to a well-being economy, which is a destination framework, and the pathway towards that. The pathway for the US, Europe, is that we are already far above our fair share of Earth carrying capacity. So our goal is to very much reduce our ecological footprint while maintaining human well-being for everybody. So the concepts there include the just transition, for example. We have to go to renewable energy, but it can come at the cost of the more of lower income people. It's totally possible, but you have to have the right policies there. Very different for other economies, and some of them are even below still their fair share of Earth carrying capacity. At lower material footprints, there is more often, not always, but more often a correlation between economic growth and human well-being. So for them, the growth makes sense. And you could even talk about doing that in what could be called green growth policies. But green growth in Europe has done nothing but brought more environmental destruction, really. And it's interesting to see that, because they're talking about decoupling, right? Oh, we can decouple carbon emissions from economic output growth. It's not happening. It's just not in the data. It's not there. It would be great if it is, but it really isn't there. There are a few countries that have decoupled a little bit, but not anywhere near to where they would stay within their share of the Paris Agreement. Not anywhere near. No country in the world. So it's not there. And so what they have to do is really also just reduce their economic output. And you can do that in a way where human well-being is maintained. The reason that this is currently not the case is because that means you have to share what you already have more equally. So it really goes into the redistribution and the income and wealth inequality we see in those areas as well.
Which is somewhat the antithesis of capitalism in the US, right? You can drive your success, you have all these individual opportunities, but then the mindset here is a lot about growth. It's a lot about, I made it, so do I have to share it? I mean, it's really going to be about changing the mindset on the individual level as well, I imagine.
God, this is so good. Thank you again for that question. Because now we get to the next level of this iceberg that we talked about, right? We had the events, and then we had the patterns, which are created by the structures. That's the economic structures we've been talking about. What's underneath that? That's our mindset. It's the narratives we tell each other about how the world works, how it should work, and how human beings work, right? The Homo economicus is also one of those stories. And so we have to change, in order for this to work, we have to change those underlying narratives that we tell each other. What is freedom, right? What is fairness? Those kind of things that's the kind of questions that touch on what you just mentioned. What is really fair in a society? Do we really have all the equal opportunity? I think it's pretty obvious that we don't, right? Some of us start a lot farther back behind than others, and so that's the kind of really that's what's happening right now. That's why it's also what's going on is so confusing, because I think it's quite obvious that our current economic system isn't working anymore. That's why you see this rise in populism. I think it's very broadly understood that the current system isn't working. You see that in surveys as well. I think that's why my research went viral, that people were like, I knew it. I knew there was something where it just wasn't working. But what is this new narrative? And some people are clinging to what populists say, right? We need to go back to the old orders and stricter hierarchies. And there's a different narrative that's I would say almost diametrically opposed to that, and that's the kind of narrative underlying a well-being economy.
So explain it. I know we've touched on it in different ways, but define or explain what is a well-being economy.
So a well-being economy is where organizations, companies, government, and citizens all work towards contributing to human and ecological well-being. And companies can do that by making profit, but it will be in service to that higher purpose.
Essentially, if we don't have food on our table, we don't have, mental stability, we don't have the resources or a healthy environment, that in and of itself would crash any economy at some point.
Yes, and it sounds like your underlying assumption is that if we don't pursue growth, we're not going to be able to give that to anybody anymore, or not to everybody anymore. And it's interesting because right now we don't give that to everybody, right? We have a growing amount of homeless people. We 1 in 5 children goes to bed hungry in the U.S., which I think is a national disgrace, given that we're the richest country in the history of the world. So this idea that our current economic system does such a great job is I think could be examined in more detail. And the thing with a well-being economy is that human needs and ecological well-being are met by design, not fingers crossed through growth. So I would argue it would be much better there. You would get situations where, you know what, nobody gets a second house until everybody else has their first house, those kind of things. So this minimum that we need for a decent human life, that would be the first priority in a well-being economy, and of course while staying within planetary boundaries.
Okay, so I think that building that mindset, it's probably not just changing it at the adult level, but reaching out at the younger primary level of children in school, and what they teach, I think, shapes a mindset, I imagine, too. Speaking from what I observe in some of the kids around me and in school, they do talk a lot more about environment, where we're headed with our resources, issues of homelessness and immigration. And I imagine, I'm projecting here my opinion, but that we need to shape the mindsets of the people when they're younger, as opposed to saying, I'm going to change the mindset of a 60-year-old.
Let me say I'm wary a little bit of this stance. I see this more often, where people are like, "Oh, the younger generation's so much better at this." I'm like, it's not their responsibility. Okay, by the time they have the power to change this, it will be too late. So no, yeah, that's very admirable, and that admiration is gonna fuel our action right now, because it's up to people listening to this podcast and you and I to make that change. They don't have the power yet. The mental health of the younger generation is pretty bad, because you're right, they do understand what's going on and they feel powerless.
Well, that's the anxiety that
Yeah.
it's building up. So you're right. I guess if we look at it, we're in 2025, and some of the projections are saying by 2040, right? So we've got 15 years. So we need all the adults in the room to step up.
Yeah, and listen, I'll be very honest with you. I don't think we have 15 years left, and I think now, given where we're heading, I don't think a collapse is unavoidable. I don't think a collapse is avoidable anymore. We can still make it a more just collapse, so the cost of it are borne not by the most vulnerable people, which is definitely where it's heading to right now. And more importantly, again, it's not going to be the end of human civilization. So we have to rebuild after that. And so these are also the building blocks for how we get something better this time. And I would say rediscover what has been our economic system for most of time. I think it's important to put that in historical perspective, because everybody here has grown up with this idea of we have to have growth. Come on, without growth you have stagnation, you fall behind, you have social unrest, you have people losing their jobs. That's not good. But for most of human history, we had steady state economies. Okay, so we had economies, we had exchanges, people had differentiation in jobs, but they didn't have this perpetual growth. And for most of human history, it was actually considered foolish to have that as an ultimate goal, and or if not downright immoral, because people knew that it could lead to a lot of damage. So it was really only somewhere it was really only invented a few hundred years back in Europe by aristocrats, but it really only took a hold of us in the 1950s,
You mean
when
the idea of growth or
yes,
the
and that
persistence?
when it first was measured with GDP, that's really when it got turbocharged. So we've been doing this for several decades, longer than any of us have been alive, but hardly like a blip in the history of humanity.
Well, maybe we could compare it. I'm kind of being devil's advocate here, but you look at the Roman Empire. I mean, that was, we'd say the concept of grow, and in a way, that was a growth concept, right? Look how huge the Roman Empire expanded and then it collapsed. So I suppose we can look at the human concept of growth that did exist for some back then, but then again, that was for leaders
No,
and for different
no, wait.
purposes.
No, it's a good point. I think it's in all of us. This aspect there, and you see this also in a lot of folk tales and stuff. That the dangers of never being satisfied, never having enough. So this is true. You're right, and that example also shows how, if you have that, ultimately it will lead in collapse. This is what
Mhm.
happens in nature. The economy is no exception to that. So you're right. I would say that was also much more in territory, but you're very right in that it's this growth imperative, whether it was in land or measured by GDP, is in all of us, and we see it in history, and it was recognized in history also in many cultures as dangerous, and they had alternatives for that. For most of human history, people, that was more prevalent, but we've seen both, and it's something to keep in mind for that.
But again, that wasn't sustainable either. So now you made a very bold statement saying that decline or collapse is unavoidable. Is that really so? And I know
Yeah,
you say we're not going to have like the loss of humanity, but
no.
a decline. I mean, that's pretty intense. You really don't believe there's any way to avoid it. We've gone too far.
I would love to be wrong. I also think that for a very long time I held off on concluding that, because I feel like when you're privileged, it's your duty it's your responsibility to give up last. I do think at this point, if you look at the data, I would go into the territory of toxic optimism if I said that it was still avoidable. Because if you look at the data, like the climate change tipping points, for example, or in general ecosystem breakdown, if you look at the biodiversity loss, all those things, scientists have been warning for tipping points for a long time. They all put it here. So since the limits to growth, more people have warned about it, and this is where we are. And you see that if you look at the climate change, it's easy to ignore because the Trump administration has scrubbed all mention of it, but you can't. The data is still out there, and this is it. We're already at the tipping point.
So, is there something that people at the individual level can do? Because obviously, government involvement, company involvements will affect even faster, larger change. But at the individual level, if someone asks you, "What can I do?" Because I really believe this whole philosophy of a well-being society, but how do we affect change?
Yeah, I get that question often, and I always say it starts with changing this narrative within yourself. So it's very interesting because it's so overwhelming, right? And then at the same time, the systems change journey starts on a deeply personal level with a lot of emotional work, and really finding yourself, which part of yourselves you have disowned and cut off because of these narratives that we tell each other, because that's really the underlying narrative where it starts. This thing where we're told that we are selfish beings and kindness is a tactic to propagate our genes, and impacts on others are not material to us. We discount them as externalities. that has cost us some inner trauma. And I would say especially men have a lot of emotional work in general to do there. And then you have to start working from this new narrative. And the old narrative I would call the story of separation. And you work from a new story in which we are nature, the story of interdependence, and that we, once our basic needs are met, we rejoice in giving back to others, and we need a sense of community and a sense of purpose. And if you start from that narrative, then you have to work in the bigger, because it's not just enough to be enlightened and sitting on your yoga mat at home, because nothing's going to change from that. It starts there, but it cannot stay there. So then if you ask me to give a very blunt answer to your question, what can you do as an individual? As an individual, you can do nothing. We're not going to purchase our eco products way out of here. So we have to make systemic change by connecting with others. So you can certainly do that online. That, I think networks are still a great tool for that, but I would encourage you to keep that local as much as you can. This bioregioning, reconnect with others in your community, and tailor solutions together, co-create solutions that work for that specific location, taking your entire local ecosystem into account. And that's, I think, how we around the world can connect and really change the system.
Oh, well, that makes really good sense. That's good advice. And so, what do you, reflecting on your extensive experience, your research? You were talking about we're either going to move forward by design or disaster. So, what would be your suggestion? We're going to go by design. We have to design for sustainability. What to wrap this all up? What would be the most important message you want to get out there?
Yeah, there's so many answers to
I
that, but I
know.
do think that it comes back to this notion of basically becoming indigenous again, understanding that it's not us protecting nature or anything, right? We are nature, and that's really something that we truly feel that and understand that, and understanding the opportunity in that as well. This idea that this is something that is often, I think, misunderstood. When I say, well, the first misunderstanding is that I'm anti-growth. I'm not anti-growth. I think it's fine. I just think it's a ridiculous ultimate goal to have. And then the second one is like, okay, so I guess we in the West have to give things up, right? And like, well, no, you would have less stuff, but you would have more of what you really need: a sense of community, a sense of purpose. And I think those are easy trades. It's an upgrade, I would say. And so truly understand that after things have inevitably been lost to us, and dealing with that grief and this rediscovery of who we really are as human beings, I think that is the way forward. And again, this is already, humanity has lived with that notion for most of history. It's still best preserved, I think, in indigenous communities today, but it's really a rediscovery of who we really are, and from there we build up new structures that fit that narrative better.
And I think it's really important to notate, as we were discussing earlier, you were saying for this change and this way forward, we're not talking about indigenous small countries or cultures. You're saying it has to come first from the rich nations, the ones who are consuming the most and essentially causing more of the damage.
Yes, and for what? Because the growth hasn't made us happier. Happiness is what has
Apparently not.
decoupled.
Yeah.
That's I didn't finish my thought there when because I got lost about the decoupling of carbon emissions. That's not there. But what has decoupled is happiness. It has been stagnating, if not declining, for the last few decades that we've been pursuing this growth, which makes total sense if you think about it. Because once your needs are met, you just, more of that stuff doesn't make you much happier. And so, there's a difference between needs and wants, and our material needs are met, and our emotional and spiritual needs are unmet. And they're substituted with a lot of wants. That's why marketing is an enormous sector. It's completely superfluous if you think about it. If you look at human well-being, it contributes very little, if not detracts from it. So it's really about redesigning our structures to really fit human and ecological needs.
Well, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I imagine, for others who want to delve deeper as well. I understand you did write a book maybe in the last couple of years. Can you explain just a little bit about that? Because then maybe people can go in and understand this whole concept
Yes,
further.
of course. It's freely it's free for download online. A lot of publishers reached out to me after my research went viral, and I was like, "Can you give it away for free?" And so there was only one that responded to that, and they were like, "Listen, if they want a copy, they have to pay for it, but we'll put up a free PDF online." So that's you can just go if you Google Gaya Herrington with an E. 5 insights for avoiding global collapse. It's there. I will say I am since I wrote that book. I have unfortunately become more pessimistic about uh, our ability to avoid it. But there's still, it's like I said, it's still the same building blocks for how to do that, how to be more resilient in this collapse and rebuild afterwards. There's also a TED talk if you're interested. This might be easy if that's more like your style. There's a TED talk online as well.
Well, I really appreciate it because I think you taking us through this whole conversation, showing us very bluntly where we're at. And talking about a collapse being potentially, as you said, unavoidable, at least we understand where we're at to know how to move forward and become healthier. So I think that's a great starting point for people to accept and want to change. So thank you so much for all of your insights and being in session with us today and sharing.
Thank you.
Much
It was my pleasure.
Thank you.